Now, I will probably film a different intro for this, but we are going to be making apple honey mead, which is actually based off a recipe from the game Skyrim, the Honeybrew mead, if anybody remembers that game. This is by far the most popular mead I've made. I have had friends and coworkers ask me to make batches of it for them. So, we start with a bucket with 5 gallons of water in it. Now, we need to sterilize all of our equipment. I'm going to be using the Star San, whereas you could use bleach or any other, heat. This is just the easiest, and it's commercially available. So we get 1 ounce of Star San into 5 gallons of water. And for anybody wondering, this is a 6-gallon bucket. So now every tool we are going to use in this process needs to be dipped in here. We're going to dip everything in, let it dry. It should sit with the solution in it at least 1 minute to sanitize it. The advantage of doing this in our fermenting bucket is that we are sanitizing the bucket at the same time we are sanitizing all of the equipment. Now your airlock is going to be a little difficult to sanitize. The main way to do it is just rotate it. So we're going to need a pot later. I'm not going to sanitize the pot I'm not going to dip it rather. And the reason is I actually put water in it and boiled the water for 10 minutes. So it's already been sterilized. But everything else we're going to use is going to need to start over. Now, the honey I already have in a bath of warm water in the sink. So I've got all of the honey in a bath of hot water with the sink constantly going. The hot honey is going to let it flow a hell of a lot easier. So this step quickens everything else. Now the bucket is the only thing that after that minute has elapsed, I'm going to rinse it out, because any sterilizing solution left in the bucket is going to kill our yeast, and we don't want that. This pot I sterilized by filling it up to the top with water and boiling it for 10 minutes, so this doesn't need to wait. But what we are going to do is put a half gallon of apple juice in here. Brand's not really important, So anybody who remembers, a half gallon is about 8 cups. If you put a little more or a little less, it's not going to hurt anything, really. We want to put this on low heat because we do not want it to boil. So we're going to have to keep a constant eye over this. So now we need to prepare the yeast. To do that, we're going to take a 1/4 cup of warm water. Now this needs to be about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So it should be warm to the touch but not hot, or you can kill the yeast. Into that, stir in about a tablespoon of sugar, and then make sure that your yeast packet has come up to room temperature. If it's cold from being in the fridge, you can actually shock the yeast with the temperature difference and kill it anyways. So now you take 3 apples, wash them with soap and water, and then take your knife that we sanitized earlier. So we're just going to cut the top of it off, the bottom of it off, and now you have a snack. For the rest of the apple, cut it into thinnish slices. I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not going to say it exactly matters. The more surface area you have, the better for our purposes, though. And of course, you've washed your hands with soap and water. You've washed the apples with soap and water. You've sterilized the knife and the cutting board, because sterilizing your hand and the apples was not exactly a possibility. And you can do this however you want. I like to just make about 1/8 slices. Again, kinda, the thinner the better. But effort that I do not have. Effort and patience I do not possess. And knife skills I probably lack. So there's all of our apples. So now we've got our bucket, which I washed with soap and water. We have sterilized it. I have rinsed it to make sure that there's no sanitizer left. So what we're gonna do now is pour 2 entire gallons of apple juice in there. And if you give it a little swirl when you're pouring, it'll actually drain faster. Now we want this to be a very turbulent process because the air in there is actually going to help us. If you so desire, you can go ahead and throw all of your apple slices back to our pot. And take a look at your yeast starter. Smell it. If it smells like bread and you see foam, you've got live yeast. That is a very good sign. Again, we want to see it start to heat up and simmer, but we do not want it to boil. So we see bubbles starting to form, and we're going to cut our heat to low. Give it a stir to make sure it doesn't boil. And now we're going to put all of our honey in there. Just going to pour. You see how easily that honey flows? That's from us warming it up like we did. And if you really want to be thorough, you can scoop some of it out of there. Scoop a little. Put the lid back on and swish it around. And then pour it in. You've got all of the honey out of your jar. We're going to end up adding about 5 pounds of honey to this. And you see that recrystallized honey in there? If we scoop some of this in there and shake it up for a minute, that recrystallized honey will actually remelt. So now we are about a 1/4 pound short. I'm just going to guesstimate. Looks like a 1/4 pound to me. This is not an exact science by any means. But now we need to stir it until all of that honey dissolves. This is the reason why we needed it to be hot. The apple juice being saturated with sugar, don't stir that. Don't stir that vigorously. But the apple juice being saturated with sugar means that it really doesn't want to absorb that honey like we want it to. By heating it up, we can make it super saturated. Now, in effect, our goal here is really just to thin the honey out. Honey never goes bad because it's so sugar dense that no bacteria, mold, or anything can really grow in it. So, by getting hot water and dissolving our honey into it, we lower its sugar content to the point where yeast can live. Yeast being essential to the whole fermentation thing is what we want. So you mix this pot up and get it nice and incorporated. You just kind of feel for it when you don't feel honey on the bottom anymore. But we don't want this screaming hot for 2 reasons. We don't want it to be so hot that it denatures the sugar so that the yeast have nothing to eat. But also when we pour it into our bucket, we don't want it to be so hot that it brings the average temperature up too high. Yeast can only live in about 100 degrees. Which is why it is absolutely critical that we keep this pot as cold as we possibly can. And why when we put our yeast starter in, that we use water that you don't even think is warm. You just think it's room temperature. Because 100 degrees will kill yeast, while body temperature is 98 degrees. So now we have our bucket of apple juice and apple slices. We will take our honey apple juice mixture right into the bucket. If you want, you could put some apple juice in this pot to swirl around. Now it is worth noting you can really use any apple juice, filtered, unfiltered, whatever, it doesn't matter. One of the main draws to using like a commercial apple juice is that it is pasteurized. meaning that any kind of bacteria that was in there that could fuck this up is going to already be dead. If you use wild, then you have to be very careful about introducing wild bacteria into this, or wild yeasts, which could throw off your flavor. We're using a champagne yeast, which doesn't really matter all that much. This is going to end up being between kind of a beer and a wine. It'll be carbonated like beer, but I would almost say it tastes closer to a wine. So one of the implements that we sanitized earlier was this. It's a paint stirrer from like Home Depot. All this is a labor-saving device. Now, if you don't have a paint stirrer, or you can't go to the store and buy one, or whatever the case may be, then you could just sit here stirring this with a whisk, and that would be perfectly fine. My problem is, I am lazy as fuck. So we need plenty of oxygen incorporated into our liquid that the yeast has something to do. Yeast in the presence of oxygen reproduces. Yeast in a oxygen-deprived environment makes alcohol. So we're going to stir this for about 60 seconds, 1 minute. So the reason for doing that, to incorporate all of our oxygen into there, and I've kind of found best practice is to stick it all the way to the bottom of the barrel, and then once the liquid starts spinning like you want, then to kind of pull your stir up a little bit, because it being off the bottom where it can get a little bit of that air is really going to help mix that oxygen in there. Because where it's all frothy, that's exactly what we want. The frothier it is, the more oxygen it has, and therefore the better the yeast can reproduce. So we take our yeast starter again. Still got that nice bready smell. It's getting foamier as time goes on. We're going to go ahead, pour that in here. Maybe rinse our glass while we're doing it. Make sure we get all of it. So now I like to pick it up, just back and forth, get it loosely mixed in. Now one of the big caveats here is we don't want to overmix it, because now that now that the yeast is in there, it can be overstirred and may make a funny smell if we overmix. So now we're good to put our lid on that we sterilized earlier. You'll notice a hole cut in here. That hole is exactly the right size for my bong, so I take a little bit of my sterilizing liquid I used earlier, and you take that sterilizing liquid, you fill it about halfway. I filled it a little much. The exacts don't matter, as long as you have enough water in it. That's about halfway. And then while this is wet, because wet makes a better lubricant, the reason that I use our sanitizing liquid to do this is I don't want any kind of bacteria or fungus or anything like that growing in the airlock. So by using the sanitizing liquid, not only is it sterile when we start, but it also stays sterile throughout the entire brew. The main reason that I have 6-gallon buckets is if I want to make a 5-gallon batch of something, you need that extra gallon of room. Otherwise, it'll get bubbly as it ferments. That can actually cause your brew to bubble up out of the airlock. And at that point, you've got a gigantic mess. It's not necessarily ruined, because as long as stuff is going out and not in, but for the love of God, that will make one hell of a mess. And that is a mess I really don't feel like cleaning. So always leave a little bit of headroom in anything you're fermenting. Now keep in mind, things like yeast are light sensitive. So I take a nice cheap towel. Use the expensive towels and your wife may kill you, because if alcohol gets on this, it will bleach the towel. This is dual purpose. It stops light from getting into the bucket, but it also helps insulate it a little bit. So your house being, about 60 to 70 degrees is the perfect temperature for this. A little bit hotter will make it ferment faster, but you'll get more byproduct flavors. A slower ferment will make it take longer, but it will also make less of those byproducts, so I think it'll taste better. Too cold and the yeast goes dormant. Too hot and the yeast dies. So, we have a nice 65-degree house. I'll wrap it in a towel like this to help insulate and slow down those temperature changes. Hopefully it'll stay a nice about 65 the entire ferment. So, because we've only used half the volume of this drum, it's going to take about a day before we actually see any bubbling. Because the yeast has to not only use all of that oxygen and displace that air, but then it has to create higher than atmosphere pressure. And the more water you have in the water lock, the higher the pressure inside the bucket has to be before it's able to push it out. Because the bubbling is just the pressure equalizing. So everything's been sanitized and cleaned. It's finally dry. So now we want to pour off most of this, but at the very bottom is going to be some yeast that we don't want to pick up. So this is our primary fermentation. It stopped bubbling, so we're going to put it into a secondary vessel there and let it sit a little bit longer, just to make sure all of the fermentation is done. This siphon pump is both the best and the worst thing I've ever used, because it has the clip to attach to the side, and it's a self-starting siphon, but the cleaner I use causes it to crack and split, and I don't know what kind of cleaner I'm supposed to use to stop that. So we're going to go all the way down to the bottom of the bucket, and then I'm going to go about an inch off of that. Keep a close eye on it. Because the name of this game isn't perfection, it's just trying to avoid sucking up solids. So even though it's a little broke, it can still start a siphon. Some people want to keep their siphon right below the surface of the liquid. Now, although that is probably best practice, it's not strictly necessary. And you can see all of the liquid we're pulling up is about a beer color, which is what we want to see. If it starts to get super cloudy or anything, you're probably sucking up the yeast at the bottom, and we don't want to do that. So those are our slices that we threw in there for kind of nutrients and flavor. But the lower down we get, you can see the yeast bed. So the yeast bed is when the yeast is active, all of the yeast has a short lifespan. Now I'm going to tilt this a little bit, try to get some more of that. Again, this is just an initial siphon, so I'm not worried about keeping 100% of the yeast out. So you can see there at the bottom, all that delicious looking stuff. That is the yeast bed at the bottom and our apples that are left. So the reason why we stir so much at the beginning is when yeast has oxygen, it begins aerobic respiration, where it uses the oxygen but it reproduces. So as your very early yeast dies off from old age, the yeast it created will live on and keep going. So remember, yeast is a living organism that reproduces. Now, the issue you run into is if you don't have enough oxygen in the initial, fermentation, the yeast can't reproduce, and then it takes forever. But breaking down complex sugar in honey also takes a while. So this has actually been about a month since we started this bucket. So with the initial fermentation, we're just trying to get most of our beer or most of our mead off of that bed of yeast. And then now that it's been mixed up a little, there's a little more oxygen, and we've removed most of the debris, we're going to leave our second batch in a bucket to ferment another week or two. And if we don't see any more pressure build up, we know that the yeast is done and completely dormant. Which, if the fermentation is done, it either means that it ran out of sugar, and if it ran out of sugar, that means that, you know, it no longer had a food source. Or it could mean that the high alcohol content has killed off the yeast. So that is what our mead looks like right now. It's not very clear. But like I said, we are gonna put a lid on this. We're gonna let it sit a little bit longer. And then once all of the yeast has had a chance to settle out of this, which is why we try to leave it undisturbed for about a week, a lot of the yeast will settle to the bottom, the debris will settle out of it, and if there's any more fermentation to be done, we want it to go ahead and happen. Because when we put it in a sealed, you know, container or bottle, if it keeps fermenting, it can cause that bottle to explode. And that'd be a really shitty day. Now, as far as the leftover yeast, I mean, obviously, this all makes a good compost. There is active yeast in there that's gone dormant. It is possible for you to dry it, use it as a supplement. I know people that will like put it in the fridge somehow, and they'll use this yeast to make their next batch instead of having to continuously buy yeast. Honestly, I am probably just going to throw it out in the yard to act as fertilizer for the garden, because I don't know how to make it go dormant and reuse it. And I only do this like once a year, so it probably wouldn't live that long anyways. So I'm going to clean out this bucket really well. I've sanitized both my siphon and the other bucket, so I know that we've not introduced any new bacteria. And if there's a little bit left over, sanitizing may not be strictly necessary because the alcohol content should kill it. However, I am paranoid, so I went ahead and sanitized everything. And this is the reason why we put it into a separate bucket and we let it settle. All that at the bottom is yeast. And you can see there's just a splash of this left. It's gotten so cloudy where it started to suck up the yeast. I'm not really interested in it. So that'll become fertilizer. However, you can see just how clear these are.